Margaret Kimberley from Black Agenda Report, Black Alliance for Peace, and the UNAC Administrative Committee. We have our two speakers today are Judy Bello and Danny Haiphong. I will introduce them more properly in a moment. You know, and I'll keep my comments somewhat brief. It's an interesting thing about the United States. Americans are loath to think of themselves as being propagandized. It's a term that is connected with other countries that our government doesn't like and tells us not to like. So if you start talking about propaganda, people will immediately say China or Russia or whatever country we're supposed to dislike. And it's never true for this country or any country that's considered an ally of our ruling class, anyone liked and given approval by the corporate media. They there's no propaganda there. But I think we have to realize, and I know our speakers will talk about this, about the information we receive, the way we receive it from the corporate media, who march in lockstep with the political duopoly, and the way information is distributed, if it's distributed at all. What information do we get? What is forbidden? What is it that we don't get? We now have a situation where, and I will give you one example of particular concern to me. We have been told since 2013 that the government of Syria is gassing people using chemical weapons. And these charges have always been questioned. And the last time, in 2018, when the U.S. actually struck militarily against Syria, we were told that people in Douma had been attacked by their country. Well, in recent months, we have seen whistleblowers come forward from the OPCW, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the international body given authority to investigate these things. And several whistleblowers have come forward to say that that did not happen, that there was no chemical weapons attack. This should be a big story, but it is not a story at all. Unless you know who to follow on social media, you have no idea that this has taken place. So that is just an example of a lie of omission, and omissions are also lies, by the way. So if they don't tell you something, then you are being fed a lie about domestic policy, about international policy, and we are this weekend interested particularly in an anti-imperialist formation. So I'm going to let our two speakers begin. I'm going to introduce them both. Judy Bello, immediately to my right, is also on the UNAC Administrative Committee. She's a founding member of the Upstate Coalition to Ground the Drones and End the Wars, Upstate being New York State, and a member of the board of Syria Solidarity Movement and One Democratic State of Palestine. She administers the Younet Blog. She produced this document. Yay! And she's a website also for One Democratic State of Palestine and for Upstate Drone Action. And she is one person who takes very seriously a question that we got in the last session. She's traveled with peace delegations to Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Syria, among other places. Give it up for Judy Bello.
Thank you.
And I will introduce Danny Haiphong. is also a colleague and comrade. He's one of our contributors at Black Agenda Report. His work has also appeared in independent media such as American Herald Tribune, Counterpunch, and Mint Press News. Last year, he co-authored an amazing book. He's selling it here this weekend, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. A mouthful of a title, but an excellent book, which I highly recommend. So I'm going to turn it over to our other panelists. So Judy will begin. Go ahead.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, I came here and I thought talking about propaganda, Margaret just talked about how a lie, how hiding information is also a lie. And I think the big story in the last couple of years, or since Trump became president really, is the hiding of information. It's become very, very difficult to share information with the open public. And I guess I want to say, though, that this didn't start with Trump, and so I'm going to take another step back and look at it going back to the beginning of the Obama presidency. So that's quite a while now, 15 years. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I was very active at the time. We were doing our anti-Iraq war stuff very busily back in the mid single digits of 2000. And we had worked very hard to get some money and in a small upstate city where I live, and we were airing Democracy Now!, which at the time seemed like a really good source, although I wouldn't recommend it right now. We were airing it on a public TV station at that time, or not TV, a public radio station at CENTCOM, just a regular radio station. The manager there was supportive of our issues, and so he facilitated us. We had like unlimited free ads. We would go in and record our ads and stuff. It was really wonderful. And so I was paying attention to what was happening in the media, which already had collapsed into these giant mega corporations. So say if there's 10 major FM stations in Rochester, 5 of them belong to Clear Channel and 5 of them belong to CENTCOM, and none of them are really local. So, but we had this one, at any rate, we had this situation, and in the early part of 2009, all of the liberal radio stations, talk shows, radio stations, were removed from the air. Just removed. And it wasn't just us. First we were like, oh my God, how could you take this away? It's the only one we have. There's 3 conservative ones and we have only this. And they were like, no, this is a thing. They removed them all across the country. CENTCOM did. And to my knowledge, Clear Channel never does anything, even vaguely not conservative. But anyway, so this was the beginning of this censorship. And suddenly, all these people had nowhere to go. All these people with regular radio shows, and you know where they went? RT, Russia Today. Those darn Russians meddling in our affairs. They actually adopted all these people that have been driven out of the media by the U.S. corporations. And so that was actually how I came to be familiar with RT, because I was following my regular things, not necessarily Democracy Now!, but a lot of the other people that I listened to, they all went over to RT. So when we look at this issue of how to understand things and how do people get information, it's really quite terrifying, and Americans don't like to admit that 20 years ago and 30 years ago, the media, at least parts of the media, were always lying to us. But it was okay in a sense, because we could put our stuff out there and people could find it and listen to it. Anyone with the least bit of independence in their search could go out and find some information. And but now what's happened is we've been shut out of the search engines and the social media. And so I just wanted to touch on it. The first, I hope we remember that first the Washington Post named this prop or not. Nobody ever heard of them. And you go there and they have a whole list, including Black Agenda Report and, Truth Out and Counterpunch, and just a whole long list of all the blogs that everybody goes to get any information that are news outlets really at that time, and discussion of things from the perspective that's not exactly what the government wants you to think. So meanwhile, we have the national press more and more in lockstep, and on the other side, we have the door closed. So then people are sharing information in other ways, and at first it was proper not. Well, nobody ever heard of them. They don't matter. So then after that, we go to Harvard Library has the same list up in their thing. So now young people who are studying law, studying political science, studying social sciences, are forbidden to go to these places. They're told that they're propaganda outlets for foreign countries, and this is the place where the real discussion, not just leftists like us, but also libertarians are all out there having our real discussions of the news of the day. And there's some people who are real professional, who have been longtime professional reporters who've been driven out for one reason or another. People like Chris Hedges, for instance, who are now also in that sphere, or like Robert Perry of Consortium News, people who broke big stories that the government didn't want you to know, and now they have their own outlets. So when this happened, well, first nothing really happened. It was like, bing, wake up. And then a few months later, everything disappeared from the Google search engines and a lot of the other search engines. Like if you go out, if you're a technologist, which I am, you go out to put a search engine on your website, you adopt a little Google search engine. Well, now Google's not carrying our website. And so where do I find a search engine? Writing your own, even if you know how, is a huge job. So any rate, this is the next thing. And I want to just say that you have no idea of how powerful Google is on the internet. Be aware that Google is probably the biggest threat, worse than Facebook, really. Facebook is, sharing a lot of information, and they're shutting things out and not others. But Google controls whether my website shows up in your browser. And if they want to, for whatever reason, and so far mostly it just has to do with tracking malicious software, but right now they're doing more than that already. If they put up a notice on people's screens, so somebody hears about you and say, oh, there's some good articles there, and they go to your website, and they get a notice up that says, this is a toxic website. It's dangerous. It might kill your computer. It might, twist your children's minds. And so, again, we have another huge, there's all these threats being thrown in people's faces. And so I guess I won't babble on. I guess I want to bring up one more aspect of the censorship, though, really quickly, which is that with the upstate drone action, when we first started doing civil resistance in Syracuse, New York, we had people from across upstate New York. And oh my God, the first time we had like 32 people get arrested. This was our first big thing. Out at the base, we were just like lying in the driveway. The chief of police actually came out and greeted us while we were sitting handcuffed on the curb, and did a little press op. But it was carried by all the local news stations. It was carried by Central New York News all over New York State. It was carried in the national news. We had people tracking us across the country. This was a very big deal. People didn't know about drones, and suddenly the threat of drones to people around the world became spread everywhere. And at that time, I doing the website, I had something I call a tracker, and it was picking up news of drone strikes from around the world. And so I was publishing them, just the headlines and links to them on our website. And all of a sudden, several years later, we got less and less and less press. And now we get zero press. We can go out there, no matter what happens, we get jerked around in court, and we get no press. And my trackers don't work anymore. They just don't work. I get nothing. I get what does your children want to buy toy drones, and the U.S. government is now going to use drones to see about, in commercial airspace. Nothing. Nothing about drones being used for military purposes. So I just want to raise this because what part of our conversation I hope will be, what can we do about this? Because you might be here listening to us, and you might actually have followed the drone thing, or you might follow some of those websites on the long list because you know about them. And but what about all those people out there who just look up drones, or who just look up AntiWar, or who just look up the latest news that they think happened on Google? They're not going to hear anything about what we have to say about it. They're not going to hear about Syria. I've had the most disturbing conversations with people I thought were my friend who go, I come back from Iran or Syria and I tell them what I saw, and they say, well, you were just being fooled. I'm like, I thought you came here because you wanted to hear about my experiences. But no, they came here to tell me I'm wrong, because the news told them overwhelmingly from every outlet the opposite. And so it's a big challenge, and you might notice, I hope that you'll go to the UNAC blog, because I try to pull news from all these sites, and aside from getting what I think is really good, interesting articles and analysis, you also get links to all the places where I found them. And I'll often print something from an obscure place once in a while, just so that I try to always get our people, the people that are affiliated with UNAC, but I also will print articles from obscure places that have interesting perspectives. So, and we put out, like Joe puts it at the end of all of our UNAC emails, and I also put out something more often depending on how busy I am. So I hope that you'll consider that, because that's one way, because then when you're, you don't have to like look through all these emails people are sending you and stuff. You have a basis for a search of the news, now that you're no longer getting that from the aggregators online. So I hope you'll consider that, and that's my one response to it. Before that, I was actually doing more writing and less publishing. But at this point, I feel like I'm doing a better service to society and expressing my opinion more clearly by providing an outlet where people can find information than by just giving you my opinion on everything, which I'm always happy to do. So anyway, I guess that's all I have to say for now, and I hope we'll have some interesting discussion in Q&A about how we can, keep the news in front of the people, not just in front of ourselves, but in front of all those other people who no longer are going to stumble across it. They're not going to stumble across what we think or what we have to say, or what, or what the international news is saying. I mean, the whole world will be saying the truth. And here in the United States, here we are, they're complaining about China. And we're getting lied to right, left, and center. And it's, those people, I really worry that we need to find ways to keep that afloat, to keep tentacles out into as broad a population as possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Before Danny speaks, could you tell people who may not know the connection with drones in upstate New York? Oh,
upstate New York, the Upstate Coalition to Ground the Drones started, I think, in 2010. And what we've been doing is civil resistance at Hancock International Air National Guard Base. And so at Hancock Base was, I think, second after the Nevada base, Creech, in being a drone center for Reaper drones. And they fly drones over Afghanistan, and we haven't been able to get too much information about where else, but they fly drones all over. And and so the drone, and so we routinely, at least once a year, sometimes more often, go out with as many people as we can get. And now, when we started out, we did wide advertising of that we were going to do this, and we'd have like 30 people or something. doing a die-in at the base or whatever, and whatever other activities. And then we go to court, and we basically keep raising international law. And they're like, but you were trespassing, and then we dispute that. And then we say, you know, we're here because this base is murdering people. They're violating international law. They're violating U.S. law because they have right in the Constitution it says that international treaties are the law of the land. So we've been doing this for a long time, and so the base knows us. Now we have to be more secretive because they read our email and stuff. But we continue and persist in going out there and resisting. We have a bunch of dangling court cases right now against people. I've gone to jail. Most of us have spent time in jail on these cases. But I don't know if that's really important other than self-enlightenment. What's really important is to publicize the fact that now they're all over the country. There's a big one in Niagara Falls, too, where we have people sitting in little rooms all over the United States killing people across the world. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thanks for explaining that. And so now we'll continue with Danny Haiphong.
Okay, appreciate it, Judy. You really showed how propaganda is shaped by the balance of forces in society. That's a fancy way of saying class struggle.
Yeah.
The propaganda we find ourselves constantly needing to debunk comes from the powers that be, an oligarchic ruling class which feeds off endless war to generate massive profits. So I think, as Judy alluded to grow our anti-war movement into a formidable force of the people, we're going to need to develop our own propaganda for our own purposes. But doing so around this all-important question of war and peace is difficult without some form of ideological agreement. And I think UNAC has done really good work bringing organizations together that may not agree on every issue, but share the goal of bringing an end to the US wars which have caused so much suffering around the planet. The problem, though, is, as Judy again alluded to, is that the reach of the imperial propaganda apparatus is as large as it is deceitful. There is no shortage of need for us, through discussion and debate, to develop the ideological tools that we need to fight the ruling class's propaganda war. And at this time last year, I was writing my book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, and I talk a lot about American exceptionalism because it's the ideological bedrock from which all wars rest. The unquestioned superiority of the U.S. way of life and the white supremacist undertones and overtones of this assumption unites the two-party duopoly on matters of war and the corporate media, and it's wrought havoc on the consciousness of the left. Some on the left would rather condemn Russia and China as imperialist countries, which is wrong, than to demand the U.S. pull out of the pivot to Asia, which places over half of all of the U.S.'s military resources in the Asia Pacific. There are more people in the United States right now mobilized to condemn Putin's mythical influence in U.S. politics than to force Washington to withdraw its tens of thousands of troops deployed to NATO countries along Russia's border. American exceptionalism is effective because it fosters a racist loathing of humanity that compels far too many to disparage people they don't know and systems they possibly cannot understand, rather than opposing the carnage that's wrought upon the people of the world by the so-called exceptional United States. So American exceptionalism, while it's so effective in mobilizing people for a war abroad, started right here in the United States. The ideological framing of the U.S. as a leader of the free world and a steward for democracy is built on the foundations of slavery and genocide. Black and indigenous peoples are the original scourges of humanity, their existence representing the antithesis of the white bourgeois democracy built in the name of profit. The same exceptionalism that's confusing the left about wars abroad has also shaped the struggle against war at home. From slave patrols to land grabs to Jim Crow racism and onward to the mass incarceration regime, Black and indigenous peoples have been victims of the pervasive mythology that the U.S. is a force for good in the world and the most civilized society in human history. So there are two critical components I want to talk about with American exceptionalism. First is the dehumanization of the exploited, the targets of war. America cannot be exceptional if it is not a white exceptionalism, which means that any nation or any people that doesn't fit the description must be treated as subhuman and disposable. The U.S., as Obama said many, many times, is an indispensable nation, and it's very clear that Syria and Libya are dispensable nations. Civilian murders are collateral damage or accidental casualties of a kill list. Black Americans are inherently criminal, culturally inferior. Immigrants are rapists. You get the picture. Then there is the erasure of history of the struggle of the oppressed, most notably the very existence of indigenous peoples themselves. We have few outlets where the history of solidarity between the Black struggle for social justice and the anti-war struggle is honored and respected. Some are willing to talk about intersectionality as long as it doesn't upset the status quo. American exceptionalism is meant to develop a love for empire, so we don't develop a love for the people. This is why Abraham Lincoln is celebrated by rappers like Common. That's why Lincoln is celebrated, but not John Brown, and why rappers like Common laud Obama for his contributions to Chicago instead of Fred Hampton. But there are opportunities in this crisis that U.S. imperialism is facing, that Glenn Ford and so many others have talked about this weekend, that are as numerous as the dangers. As the legitimacy of the empire wanes, its ideologues become all the more desperate in maintaining the status quo. So rather than just slavery or the other historical ills being an aberration to U.S. history, as we're told so much, the ruling class tells us that Trump is an aberration, that he is some Russian puppet along with our hero, Julian Assange. Even the beloved Bernie Sanders has been attacked as some sort of red communist, even though he has shown time and time again that he won't disrupt the imperial program. It's really now, at this point, that any inconvenience to the very idea of American exceptionalism is seen as a threat, and we need to look at the opportunities and the dangers that this presents. It means that the ruling class is intensifying its war on the people, and what Judy talked about with the algorithms and the corporations uniting against our propaganda apparatus is part of that. It also means, though, that we have opportunities to strengthen our movement and win people over to the side of anti-imperialism. Let's look at the example of Bernie Sanders. At the New Hampshire debate, we saw him condemn the DPRK and Xi Jinping of China as dictators. He said many times that Venezuela is ruled by a tyrannical president, Maduro. So he can stay in the good graces of the elites, but this isn't helping him at all. He is being red-baited incessantly. Now he is being connected to Russia, and also, not only that, he has also been called a communist by both the far right and the corporate Democrats. So this is an opportunity for us, I think, to show what solidarity really is. There are massive numbers of young people and low-wage workers that support Bernie Sanders and that have absolutely no interest in this narrative that the corporate ruling class on both sides of the political aisle are promoting. We can show how China right now has mobilized its entire society to fight the novel coronavirus, and that the United States has no such apparatus, has no such ability, because it is completely organized on the basis of profit and not for the people. We can show how the DPRK, despite the starvation sanctions, has a relatively stable society, and year after year calls for peace with its southern neighbor to build a united Korea. We can show, just example after example, how the attack on Bernie Sanders is really an attack on the people of the world. In 2016, I think we missed this kind of moment. American exceptionalism was really under fire. Sanders and Trump, from different ends of the political spectrum, called America's inherent exceptionalism into question. Trump did it on the basis of reviving a white exceptionalism and to do what many U.S. presidents, as Margaret's wonderful book shows, had wanted to do in the past, which is make America a whites-only country. with all of the economic benefits that come with that. Sanders wants to make the United States in the image of FDR, which I think is also a mythical notion. And thanks to the 2016 election, foreign policy questions such as the legitimacy of NATO and regime change wars were spoken about openly in the corporate media when they had to cover people like Trump and Sanders. This time around, the US is incessantly ignoring the question of foreign policy. And the increased thirst for policies like Medicare for All really gives us an opportunity to show the connections between US wars and these policies. The Democratic Party is cannibalizing its own so-called democratic system. And so we really have an opportunity, and I want to stress that, to expose the warfare state for what it really never ceased to be, an engine of empire on behalf of corporations. But unlearning American exceptionalism will be a key piece to moving the struggle against war forward. Unlearning American exceptionalism is really learning how to be in solidarity with others. It is about respecting self-determination, being curious about the social systems of other countries around the world, and withholding the impetus to make false equivalencies between victims of US imperialism and US imperialism itself. We should make no mistake that US imperialism is the root of all the world's problems today. If we can keep our sights on this target, then we can get closer to effectively debunking the US war propaganda apparatus and also provide a more favorable terrain for the world's people to liberate themselves from the scourge of imperialism. Thanks.
Thank you, Judy and Danny. Let's turn it over to you. Do we have questions or comments? All right. 1, 2, 3. And the purple is the color today. Purple beret, then Julie, and the gentleman behind. So you first.
Yes, well, oh, thank you. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Am I any louder than my regular teacher voice?
Yes.
I recently listened to a book called White Fragility by Robin DeAngelis. And this is the basis of everything in this country is white supremacy. And we as white people have got to come to terms with that. We have to study it, study it, study it, because it is unbelievable that New York Times project 1619, is it called?
Yes.
All those essays are fabulous, and they give a real good history, but we have to deal with this whole culture that we have is white supremacy. It's all about white supremacy. It started out in the South with the plantations, with slavery, 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 and that's where it's all trying to end, with slavery. They want us to continue to have slavery, but it's white supremacy. It's based, this whole culture is based on white supremacy, and you say exceptionalism, which is true, but that comes out of white people, the color, being better than everybody else. And this woman has been doing diversity training for 35 years or something like that, and she's got time after time after time and learned all of this, and there are plenty of people who are studying this now because it is trending. But it's mind-blowing to me. It's just mind-blowing, even though I have been studying it for years and years and years, but to actually come to it. So I think that, the exceptionalism part of it and the propaganda piece of it, Judy, is just, I'm on Facebook all the time, okay, and I feel like that's my job because that's the only place I can get the kind of news that I need from all of those places that you talk about. And I spread it out to all my people who I know, some from high school that, would never, ever have heard of any of that stuff, except for me putting it on Facebook, although I don't know if maybe it doesn't go out to all those people, but
Thank you.
I know I'm
That's all right.
going
That's all
on,
right.
but I really feel passionate about it.
Thank you so much. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to take like 3 questions together. So Julie next, then the gentleman behind you, and then you'll be in the... Okay, cool.
War.
All right, go ahead,
Well,
Judy.
mine is a real easy one.
Okay.
I'm not so technical, but I do look at RT for Chris Hedges and Richard Wolff. But you mentioned the radio. I didn't know radio program. You said all of your radio stations went to RT. So
I'll
I didn't.
explain when we get there.
Okay, because I didn't know they had radio.
No, I think you were saying that they took these stations off the air. Is that what you were
Right,
saying?
and so the talk show hosts that used to be on these radio stations, many of them are now on RT.
Okay.
And
So next question.
Yeah, I guess the corporate control over the media is one of the main problems. Now, if I try to personally, I try to look for what is the solution. So, if I were to make, say, or you were to make laws, of course, you wouldn't want the government or whoever is in the government to take over all of the media. But how would you solve this? Personally, I feel that if people got information from all sources, from left to right, then they would mostly, by and large, be illuminated with knowledge from left to right and pick the right solution on the average. So we need to strive to give them opportunity to get information from left to right, everything, and people should decide what they want to do. So how would you try to facilitate this sort of situation? How would you like this to actualize this kind of thing?
So let's take one more, since it was not sort of actually a question. You go ahead, and then we'll take them all together.
I fully expect the U.S. government to turn the tactics that it uses on people struggling for liberation abroad more on the American population. And I'm hoping that there's going to be, as Glenn Ford predicted, more of a confrontation over the DNC stealing the nomination. And also we know with climate change that struggles are going to get bigger. I'm wondering if they might not just censor progressive websites, but actually do cyber attacks on progressive websites, and what you think might happen.
All right, thank you. So let's take the first batch of questions, comments. The first one is about white supremacy and its role in propaganda. Does either of you?
I have one thing to say, but you can go ahead or whatever.
Sure, I'll just briefly address that. Yes, American exceptionalism equals white supremacy. In the book that I wrote, I talk about that a lot in several chapters. And, but you know,
A happy customer just bought your book.
yeah. I hope there's no one at the table though, so. Anyway, but yeah, it's definitely true. And it's the origins myth of the United States. That's really where it starts, and it's probably some of the most pervasive imperial propaganda. That is the idea. And I'm a socialist, and a lot of socialists believe that the American Revolution was some progressive development, a step forward, a move from feudalism to capitalism, all this stuff. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that, especially given the array of forces then. So we have to be able to talk about this, and the only way we can is to devise, and I think that's where this comes into the solutions piece. We need to organize our own tools. I think the independent media is immensely under-resourced right now, with under-resourced in terms of people, in terms of money, and a lot of us are working class folks ourselves. So to be able to come together to build a media apparatus that can reach more people with all of the attacks that are happening now online, one of the few places that we had over the last 10 or 15 years. Yeah, we have to do that, to have these conversations.
Judy, you wanted to say something?
One of the things that struck me that no one else has talked about, but strikes me just from my own upbringing and background, is that the middle class, the concept of a middle class is protects the white supremacist element in our culture, and it keeps people from perceiving what class struggle really is. Because the middle class, it's a construct that isn't part of the class structure. The middle class refers to anybody who makes enough money to be comfortable, and they can put on airs and say that they're bourgeois. But the reality is that, and people feel protected, and I have to laugh, but I used to think it was funny because people in my family would go, well, I'm not working class, I'm middle class, you know. But they go to work at a corporation and they get a paycheck and they could get fired. So they're working class. And I think, though, that this is one of the discriminators, really, you know, and then they say, well, now some blacks are coming into the middle class. You know, but what we really need is an abolishment of the middle class, because the concept obstructs a clear view of what class struggle really is, and it keeps people from identifying it, like highlights things like diversity politics as opposed to coherent and organic people coming together due to having similar issues, because that means that this segment of society who's middle class doesn't think that they have the same issues as everyone else, and so they're not. And I think it's really important to somehow get this out there, because for what it's worth, there's a large majority of the population, in spite of everything, are still white in this country, and it would be nice not to dismiss them as being potentially able to join in the struggle and to drop their pretensions of being different. And to do that, the first thing they have to get rid of is this idea that, you know, middle class is like safe and okay to say. You can't say, I'm a white supremacist, but you can say, I'm in the middle class. And in some ways, it means the same thing, that you're looking at yourself as separate from the rest of the people. So anyway, that's one of the things I just want to bring up in that light, and that is part of communication.
Thank you, Judy. So then third question we're going to take was about solutions.
Oh, he wants to say
Oh,
something.
do you want to you want to add to that?
On to the next question.
Okay. No, solutions. Do either of you
Go
want
ahead.
to address that?
Yeah, solutions. It's a big question. I mean, of course, the trajectory I would love to see is a revolution in the United States, and then we can figure out how to build a state that then can nationalize the media in a way that is, but you know, in a way that serves our interests. But you know, that's a ways off. We have some intermediate steps we need to take, and you know, I really do think that if we're interested in this issue of quote-unquote propaganda, the misinformation of the ruling class, then we're going to have to organize ourselves to be able to build these institutions that can reach people. I really do think that's part of it. That's part of why UNAC exists. It's why Black Agenda Report exists, to build those institutions that can not only counter the imperialist narrative, but also give people a place to go when they're searching for information. And now we have to step up our work to include how do we distribute that if the internet is really not the tool we can use anymore.
I have something there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to talk a little about just the technology of it, not to go over people's heads or anything, but we can, there are people, certainly in the open source world, building alternative tools, and we can explore it. And there are people doing that, actually. There's a lot of people out there who speak on the left and the right who are cross-posting everything they do on in different spaces. But the problem with that is, how do we then make those spaces popular enough so somebody will see it besides, again, our fans and ourselves? So there's potential out there. The question is how to utilize it. And if we build a movement, then it will be popular because it's affiliated with that movement.
Thank you. So one last question before we move on to the next group. Tactics used abroad being the tactics that the U.S. uses against the rest of the world being used here. What is your response?
I think that's already happened and happening. I think that's why we have political prisoners rotting in cages, in solitary, in death row, etc. I think, the whole move by the FBI to counter quote-unquote black identity extremists is another aspect. I do think that this war on independent media is also another aspect of how these tactics abroad are used here in the United States. And so I do think that, of course, there's room for that to intensify. So, of course, the question is very valid. And it's going to intensify and escalate as there's a crisis going on right now in the United States. Glenn Ford calls it a crisis of legitimacy. I see it as a general crisis of the system of imperialism too, where not only is there this upsurge in real genuine reforms that are just not possible right now as the U.S. is currently arranged, and that's going to be all the more clear as things progress in this election. But also the U.S.'s influence around the world is waning. That is a very real phenomenon. It's not spoken too much, even in anti-war spaces. The rise of China, its ally Russia, and a host of other countries are moving in a different direction economically, politically, because U.S. imperialism has nothing to offer. So there's domestic and international implications to that very statement, and that's going to really increase the need for the state to intensify the repressive apparatus. And we have to be aware of that. And again, there are going to be opportunities that come with that, as well as the dangers. It's going to make life more difficult, but it's also going to make the potential for struggle more difficult. More easy.
I just said one small thing, which is that the current, something to be aware of, actually, because NPR is supposedly our internal people's radio. And, a lot of well-educated people, unfortunately, are very tied, give a lot of credence to NPR, unfortunately. But, in fact, the person who currently is like the director or the top person in NPR used to be the top person in Radio Free Europe, Radio Free wherever. So this person, and that, of course, was not allowed to be broadcast into the United States. However, you might notice nowadays, now that Google has nothing else to give you, you will occasionally get hits from Radio Free Europe or Radio Free Asia. And so it's definitely, from a communications standpoint, it's already here.
Okay, next question. So, Allison.
You ask your question.
This is democratic, I promise.
Okay. Wait, so I just want to point out who. So, Younet, Marilyn.
Okay.
Betty.
Anyone else?
Who else? Someone had their hand up over here? Okay, then you will be next.
Okay, got it. Hi, Allison Bodine from Mobilization Against War and Occupation, Vancouver, Canada. Thank you all for all of your work. I just wanted to say that I think we also have to consider our work of counter-propaganda going out into the streets, that every time that we go out and hold up signs, whether it's 10 people or 10,000 people, we have to consider that part of our opportunity to link people to these pages online, to have direct discussions with people. Needs to be part of this conversation, because it's true. Twitter accounts get deleted, they get shut down, websites disappear. We all need to keep doing that work, and but when it comes to talking to people directly on the streets, that really can't be replaced, and we have to consider that part of our own counterattack against this media war that's happening against us all. And also, just I think a really good example to raise with people is Yemen. When we talk about media propaganda, Yemen is a war that basically isn't existing if you watch media, and it is funded by the United States and governments like Canada, and is something I think we need to make sure is always part of our work to say, hey, do you even know that the world's worst humanitarian crisis is in Yemen right now, and it's caused by the United States government? And so I think that's one of many examples, but an important one we need to bring up. So yeah, my kind of question is the tool of propaganda in the, the tool of going out into the streets as a form of really fighting against this propaganda. And next, I think, was Marilyn.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Levin, and I'm a co-coordinator of UNAC. And I've been involved in activism since 1960, when I was 16, and started with the civil rights movement and went on to many other anti-war and et cetera. The thing that I've seen is we didn't have, by the way, we didn't have mass media like we do today. We didn't have we didn't have computers, we didn't have the email, we didn't have the internet. However, word got out when we did our little mimeographing, et cetera, and we were able to get all kinds of information out. But the thing that really raised consciousness and that transformed people were mass movements. White people became conscious of white supremacy and what was going on in the black community when the not through their agency, but when the black community were out in the streets and were fighting for their rights. The same with all other movements, and that is what transforms consciousness, and what the women's movement has gone through various uprisings at different times and raised consciousness, and then things got quiet, and then now we have the Me Too movement, and everybody is you can't be unaware of that today. And it didn't come from a particular website. Although those, so the media, those things are very important, but the real change comes when people are mobilized and in the streets, and then the media has to report on some of that, and then our own messages can get out in a broader way.
Thank you. Betty?
Okay.
I just wanted to piggyback.
Wait for the mic so we can...
The first speaker here said, I call it the small movement. She says the people's movement. But we come to conferences like this, and I can't help but wonder if people are aware you're losing your public school system to corporations, and if people make the connection between the fact that the first corporation, the Dutch East India Company, was responsible for funding a lot of slavery. So the corporations have not changed their stripes. And you are allowing the pillar of democracy, which is the public school system, to be taken over by slaveocracy institutions, which is the corporation. So a small movement, a group of people, I think they call themselves the Granny Peace Brigade, we go into schools, specifically high schools, and we try to get into the PTAs, and we stand outside on parent-teacher night, and we pass out opt-out letters to parents to let them know the military does not have the absolute right to come in and teach your social studies classes, and you should not be funding the ROTC. Now, I've been to several UNAC conferences, and I seem to be the only one that stands up and says this, and it concerns me because I know there are a lot of teachers in unions, and it upsets me when I go outside a high school that's 99% black and Latino, and the teacher won't take my opt-out flyer to tell our children that they have alternatives to going into the military. And it's so deadly that my own godson came home listing in the ROTC, and I never would have known it if I hadn't known he cut his hair and he was wearing these black patent leather shoes. And I said, what the hell is this, a Halloween costume? And he said he was in the ROTC, so Ralph and I immediately, started re-brainwashing him. So you talk about this seeing through fog of propaganda, but it came into my own household. And I used to, as a high school principal, tell my students, if you join the Army, I'll stomp your big toe and make you a cripple so they can't use you if I can find a way to keep you out of it. It's the people, like she says. What bothers me about the left is that you have as many white racists on the left as you do on the right. And they do not know how to talk to other people. And they don't know they're racist. They don't mean any harm. like the people who ethnically cleansed my neighborhood, the first thing they did was collect all the feral cats. And then they had the nerve to complain to us about the rats. If they had spoken to their neighbors when they were invading our reservation, we would have told them, yeah, we like cats, but we don't love them that much. The cats fight the rats. So it's a human problem. You're fighting on both sides. And so please go to the high schools and teach history. Have these conferences. Get into the PTA. Nobody knows history. They don't even have institutional memory, so they don't know they're supposed to save their institutions. And a big institution is going now, which is Pacifica Public Radio. So fight some little wars and talk to people you don't usually talk to.
Thank you, Betty.
Like say hello when you gentrify a neighborhood. Just say good morning.
No, just don't gentrify. That's my thing. I don't want gentrifiers smiling at me, thinking they're getting away with something. Sorry, I'm going to disagree. So there was, someone over here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Renard. We're from St. Louis, home of Boeing and Monsanto, a couple of weapons manufacturers that are well known all around the world. I want to thank our sister Betty there for talking about opt-out. I was a high school teacher for a long time and did a lot of counter-recruitment work. I wonder if the weaponization of both medicine or traditional healing, let's say, being corporatized and removed from the traditional realm where people knew how to touch one another, take care of one another, feed one another properly, and the weaponization of food through GMOs and chemical farming. If there's room in the platforms of all of these weapons that we need to stop, to list those as weapons we want decommissioned. The rendering impossible for people to create their own mutual aid, feed one another, and care for one another, to fight the takeover of food and traditional medicine.
Okay, thank you. So let's, panelists, we will take these last few questions. Counter-propaganda action in the streets, direct action. Can we speak to that?
I'll go first this time. I'm big on direct action. I think it's a great thing. I think that you influence people very directly by doing it, and you can carry signs and things, but you can also do the kinds of things we do at the base. We used to have we used to do our bit outside the Syracuse State Fair every year with a tableau of the drone strikes, and I actually met a drone pilot who came up and was just completely, I think, enlightened by seeing that. He was quite traumatized when he left. But let me see, that was one of the issues was, I think too that we need to, I think you're right that technology can't be the only thing. And so we need to go out and be person to person. The thing about traditional medicine and so on is that... One question at a time? Oh, good. Okay, I'd rather do that, actually. I'm trying to remember, and I can't. Okay. I'm sorry.
It's all right. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I'm big on it.
Sure. Just briefly, the question about being in the streets is a good one. It's a good point. The late Bruce Dixon, though, I think also had an additional thing to add to this where, oftentimes we get out in the streets when a particular event happens around war or whatever it may be, but then we're not really organizing after that. We're not organizing during the demonstration, and Bruce Dixon always brought up the point that when we're doing this work in the streets, we need to make sure that we're also doing the organizing work, that we're gathering names, that we have a place for people to go to afterward, so we can build the real relationships, because as much as spontaneous demonstrations and planned demonstrations around whatever war we're opposing, or all the wars, or whatever it is, if we're just letting the new folks that we are getting to those demonstrations go back to living their daily life under empire, it doesn't lead to much else organizationally.
Thank you. The next question was about the mass movements that took place without the technology, and I guess the impact that technology, I'm going to use my prerogative to add to this, but anyway, the getting the word out without technology, the enormous mass movements that we had in the days of rotary phones and mimeograph machines. Who wants to respond to that?
Well, the technology is on both sides, unfortunately. So I was in Washington during several times during the Vietnam War, and we were pretty much free to wander around, and you could get in some trouble. I got tear gassed and hit with a stick and so on. But in general, we were like free to navigate it. And the police just look like police. Whereas when I've been there recently, everything was cordoned off and very organized, and the police were wearing riot gear. And this makes it much harder to have the sensation of a mass mobilization. When you look at what's happening in France right now, something that many people don't even know about, certainly it's not on the mainstream news in this country, and it's actually not well publicized even on the non-mainstream media. But France, for over a year now, they've had people in the streets every single weekend. They go to work during the week, and on the weekend they're out in the streets. And the police are just, with the gas, and they're just responding with brutality. And but at the same time, the people keep coming. And so it becomes really a major statement. I'm sure there's no one in France who doesn't think about it every day. And in fact, they were able to get a general strike going. But after a year of the Gilets Jaunes being out, then actually they shut down, they got a general strike. They shut down the trains, shut down the buses, shut down the firemen and the hospitals and the schools. They literally shut down everything. And I think if you ever had that kind of display of force in this country, nothing would ever be the same. In France, they seem to just go along boiling. But here, we never get that kind of momentum. And it's something for us to think about. Why and how could you change that? So anyway.
I'll just briefly speak to this. And I'll channel some anger at the wokey woke nonprofit industrial complex too, because there is an opportunity, of course, and technology will always be an opportunity. What we have at our disposal, all of those tools, social media, the internet, etc. Even if it becomes more repressive, it's still an opportunity to reach people, and we have to use it. But there is this fetishization of social media that especially the nonprofit industrial complex and woke activists in that area seem to think that this social media game is going to liberate us, that we're going to reach all the people we need to reach, we're going to bring everyone to the streets, and then everything will be just fine. But it's a lot more complicated than that, and we have to also recognize, which a lot of these folks don't, that public life, being able to relate to each other, has become more alienating, has become more repressive over the last several decades. We're not in unions anymore for the most part. We don't have many public spaces to organize in. It's great that we have this space, but I'm sure many of us before this were in New York City especially, were like, where the heck do we go to just meet? And I think we have to recognize that in order to build a more people's-centered and people's-oriented movement, is how are we organizing each other in person as well as in the online quote-unquote community to get what we want done.
Yeah. I'd like to add, use my moderator's prerogative to add a couple of caveats about social media. We all use it. We're all using it this weekend. But the other side is also using it. I had an experience early January, I was invited on to Press TV Iran to me and many other friends and comrades to talk after Soleimani's assassination by the U.S. And I and other people, there were hours and hours and hours of YouTube coverage, and then it disappeared. YouTube took Press TV off. There's no Press TV UK, no Press TV France, no Press TV anything on YouTube anymore. I've had an experience with Facebook Messenger. I was sending an evite, just an evite to invite people to my book launch, and Facebook labeled it as spam and removed it. People I've been in touch, and those of you who are on Facebook with me, I've been obsessed with getting people to give their contact and not to rely on Facebook Messenger to talk to people, because Facebook will take people off and you don't have their phone number, their email address, their address, nothing. So it is a tool. This technology is a great tool, but it also is used against us, and we have to keep that in mind, and we cannot be dependent upon it. So the next question, Betty was talking about corporate rule and the education system and opting out, and making sure we do the proper outreach in our public schools, and of course the schools are a tool of propaganda. She mentioned military recruitment, but in other ways as well. What do we have to say about that?
Well, I'll say that counter-recruitment was really big for a long time where I live in the small city, and that we're no longer allowed in the schools for whatever reason.
The counter recruiters are not allowed in the schools? Is that what you're saying?
We who go in and talk to people about the military are no longer have a place in the schools, and we can't get in. We used to even we used to do tabling and meetings and whatever. There's a lot of spaces you can't get into anymore in the physical world as well as the internet world. They say, let's go protest at Boeing. Well, they got the places surrounded by parking lots and then surrounded by a fence, and then there's a highway, and so where are you going to go? And if you go on the private property, they're going to arrest you. So there's a lot of it's very difficult to find spaces to operate in, and I wanted to go back to what I wanted to go back to the previous point for a minute.
Sure.
That Margaret made about technology being on both sides. And there was a guy, I think his name was Mark Owen on Twitter, and he, when we're all having all the uprisings in Iraq last summer, he showed, he knew how to do the statistics with Twitter, something I actually don't know how to do. And he showed that there was a major Twitter thing happening that was calling people to the streets. And what he showed is that it all started almost on the same day, and that the accounts that started were all brand new. They didn't exist before it started. So what he showed was that it was a false call coming from somewhere, and I wish I tried to go back and find it. So hard. So like finding something from 3 months ago on Twitter is like just torture. But basically he showed very clearly that it was all a construct that was made on the spot. It wasn't like activists who had already been on Twitter talking about things now promoting these events. It was actually totally false. And so you have to be careful on social media now. Facebook, I used to do a bunch of stuff, and I don't do almost anything on Facebook anymore. People were like getting my name because they knew I administered blogs and that I'd been to Iran and stuff. So they put me on their list for Iran or Syria or whatever, and then they would tag me in every single thing they did, and it would show up in my freaking email. And it was like a nightmare, because I'd go to look at my email and I'd have all these messages, many of which I didn't disagree with, from strangers, because all they had to do was put my name and my name in there, and boom, it was going straight through to my email. And so we have to be, we have to understand that Social media is incredibly intrusive, and we can't control it. We might use it at times, but we definitely have to be grounded somewhere else, because social media is not something that you can trust.
Yeah, thank you. Danny, did you want to read your? Okay. And the last question that we took in that group was about the weaponization of food and medicine. I'm not sure how, I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a huge international component to it. Wherever the U.S. imposes its largesse, it usually includes economic policy that enforces things like GMO seeds and, the destruction of the environment generally. So definitely it's in the calling. I remember when in, I think it was 2014, Russia banned the production of Monsanto products and the use of them, and at the same time the Obama administration passed the Monsanto Protection Act as a response to that. So it's definitely in the cards because it's part, I think, of the larger struggle against U.S. wars, for sure. In healthcare, it's the same thing. The more privatized and corporate healthcare has become in the United States, the less it is about caring for people's needs and all of the different techniques that could be used to do that.
What is the
Wait, hold.
Protection Act?
Monsanto Protection Act. It was meant to prevent boycotts of Monsanto's GMO foods.
In the United States, especially. Yeah.
Right, in the U.S. Go ahead, Judy.
Just that, again, that the U.S. does protect these things, and it takes things away from you, which I think the woman who spoke, this was part of her point. Like right now, if you go in the supermarket, you can buy very expensive homeopathic and corporate-made homeopathic and herbal remedies, but it's not the same as going to a naturopathic healer who knows what they're doing and evaluate you and prescribe something for you or assist you in selecting the things that will make you feel better. And it's also very expensive, which the whole idea of a lot of what herbal medicine especially is about is it's simpling, and it's inexpensive because it's stuff that's right in your environment. It's there anyway, so you can eat ginger soup if your stomach's upset or whatever. And these are natural solutions to your problems. And now you have to go, or turmeric's a big one. Like, I like to cook with it; it's good for you. But now people go to the supermarket and buy bottles of, encapsulated turmeric, and megadose it, and it costs a lot of money. And again, this is just corporations twisting your relationship with nature. And again, people, though, it's propaganda again, in the sense that I'd like to link it back, actually, this propaganda subject. Mm-hmm. And the same with the foods. The propaganda tells you that we're going to save the world with GMO foods, but the reality is that it kills all the real food, and so this is just another line of lies. And another, with the medicine, naturopathic medicine, the AMA is still pretty heartily opposed to it, I think. But by co-opting it and putting it into this space, it's surreal now. People are thinking that they have these magic tools, and they don't understand that this is just another form of real medicine that ought to be accessible in your environment, rather than some, trendy thing to spend your money on. So you really have to, and it may not be best to do it that way. More isn't always better. My favorite Linux tool is it's always a line, less is more, and sometimes that's true. So anyway, I guess that's what I have to say about it.
Okay, thank you. Wait.
I want to make a point about the school system.
Wait, I want.
The public school system is that it belongs to you because you pay taxes.
Yes.
And if you relate to a parent in the PTA, you can be a speaker along with the Army on career day.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to, thanks so much. Thank you for pointing that out, Betty. We're got about 10 minutes left. Phil, I saw you had your hand up. You have a question?
Let's go.
You sure? Okay. There are a couple, Joe and this young lady. 1, 2, and 3, and those are the last people.
Yeah, well, you know, there's so much more propaganda when we try to use what freedom of speech rights still exist to counter it. But what I use the term these days that they are privatizing freedom of speech. That we used to be able to go out on a corner and stand on a soapbox and talk. You know, they might get you off and have the police come and arrest you, but you could then go to the city council or something and say, I have a right to freedom of speech. But now there's not too many stores outside of New York City anyway. They're all in the malls. And the malls are privately owned. Right. So up in Albany, where I live, one of the activists went into the mall and bought a shirt that said U.S. out of Iraq during the Iraq War. And they told him he had to take it off. He said, but I bought it here. He said, you have to take it off. And he said, I have a right of freedom of speech. They said, no, this is private property. And they arrested him, and he went to court, and the court said that the mall is private property, so they have the right to say what you can wear. And so we lost that. But now we're seeing, you know, they used to have freedom of, what was it called? You had to have the same number of candidates and all these things. They never did it quite right. But now Google and Facebook, they're all privately owned. They can take us down. And so it's really the privatization of free speech. And so even with the more and more propaganda, and it is so much worse. I mean, I used to think propaganda was they swayed things in the direction that they want, but now I think it's just outright lies, and they even justify their lies, you know. I mean, you could say one thing one day and something the next day. It doesn't really matter. Truth does no longer matter, you know. And and we have very, very fewer and fewer options to counter it. So it is something we have to really figure out. I mean, alternative media is something, but we don't have the resources. We need to do it as much as possible to get some light out, but we don't have the resources that they do. In the long run, it comes down to everything else. If we want peace, or if we want freedom of speech, or if we want anything, it's all directed against the system, and we have to change that system. And that's why all of our activists more and more are saying we are against the system, and we're socialists, anti-war activists, and so forth, because that's what's needed. It's not a question, sorry, but just a comment.
Well, thank you. Okay, over here, and then one person over here.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm on the board of Women Against Military Madness in Minnesota, and also the co-director of March on the Pentagon.
Very good.
Yay. But I'm also an independent journalist and an editor of an independent outlet, and a publisher, and I make video content and graphics and stuff like that. Like my days are spent fighting censorship and fighting against the propaganda. So I just wanted to remind everybody here, I assume all of you consume independent media and alternative media sources, and to remind you to really support them as much as you can.
That's true.
If you read something and it resonates with you, share it with somebody. Probably you can on social media, but don't trust that they're going to show it to anybody. Email people, sign up for the newsletters on all of these outlets. Go directly to websites. Don't rely on social media to show you what you want to see. They're not going to. I've known so many people over the last couple of years that have been independent journalists, and they've stopped because their outlet got deleted from Facebook, and unfortunately Facebook is still the primary driver of traffic for most people to their websites. Nobody likes that. We don't like that happens, but that's where most of the people are. And if Facebook decides they don't want someone to be there and they delete a page, sometimes that really does actually take the whole entire outlet down. But a lot of these independent journalists and outlets have Patreons or have ways that you can support them even for $1 a month. And I know a lot of us don't have the money to support these people, but even $1 a month helps. If everybody in this room read one outlet and you all supported them for $1, that would really go a long way. So, sorry, I don't exactly have a
Thank
question,
you.
but I
Thank you
just
very
want to
much.
really encourage you to support independent media.
Thank you. And you get the last word.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. My name is Bill. I'm from Washington, D.C. I spent most of my time laboring in the nonprofit world, and I wanted to raise this issue. All weekend I've been staring at the Black Lives Matter sign, and the amount of funding that is going into the nonprofit world to fund alleged reform is staggering, and it has destroyed a lot of important activity, and particularly issues around police brutality, issues around the environment, prison reform, which is something that I've been dealt with in the last 20 years. And I think that it makes the situation more complicated than we think it is. There are people who are being paid to lie to us. There are people who look like us, who talk like us. We think they're really new and knowledgeable. For instance, we've been involved in D.C. in fighting the idea of a new jail being built. A whole coalition of no new jail comes up. They're funded by foundations, this coalition. Their proposals are nonsense. They're built to go nowhere, and it's meant to kind of disarm efforts to be a little bit more radical. This is happening everywhere. When the Ford Foundation gives $500 million to Black Lives Matter, what does that mean that organizing is doing? We talked a little bit yesterday about the environmental movement and about little Greta. Well, she is obviously a corporate construct. Her work, this is not a real environmental movement that is happening. And I guess when, Danny may alluded to this, but I think the issue is much more complicated than it seems. It's not a matter of getting the information out there, kind of like what you saw in Nicaragua. They create this really fake rebellion kind of thing, and then we have to fight with sort of among our peers because people got paid to do that job. But we're also trying to somehow get to the truth and all this out. I'm sorry, it's completely maddening, and it's really difficult to struggle with. And we saw it also, I think, in terms of Syria. All these fake groups popped up, defending Syria, and it caused all this confusion where I had people say, I don't know what to think about Syria.
Right.
Like, really?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'd really like to hear your thoughts about the sort of the nonprofit role in all of this. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So for our last round of questions, first question comment was about speech being privatized. Comments?
It's true.
No disagreement there.
Yes, it is. It's. I would just like to say this: the social media needs to be regulated. It should be regulated as a utility. Facebook, Twitter, all of them should be.
Google.
Yes, Google should be
Google
regulated.
Operates as a utility.
Yes, it does, and that's one of the things we need to demand. That Facebook is, yes, it is private, but it is, as someone pointed out, the de facto face of communication for everyone. They're not accountable to anybody. They can kick people off. They don't have to tell you why they kick people off. Black people especially get kicked off much faster. This is why people get mad at me. They say, you don't have a share button. I only communicate with friends. If I don't know you, I'm not communicating with you on Facebook because I can't trust people to snitch me out and end up getting me kicked off. So, yes, that happens to be true. The second point about supporting independent media. Yes, we should. Any insights aside from the obvious?
Well, I do a lot of work for free, and then I go and I work at Lowe's because it's near my house. And so, and they don't bother me too much when I'm there. It's a nice way to stay grounded in the working class because I spend my whole life at work anyway, surrounded by construction workers. But I think going back to, but I'll leave it there, actually.
Yes, we definitely need to fund independent media. We need to get better at asking for money because,
Yes.
Right.
to be honest, I work and I don't write for money. But, when you do that much labor, compensation would be nice sometimes. But, that's something that we have to learn how to do. And I think one thing that the independent media gets tripped up in is that there are people in the movement who are just much better at doing that, whose names have become almost celebrity-like, and I think we also have to figure out what are we going to do about that. How can those folks also assist independent media that doesn't have that clout? Because we need to build that infrastructure. Bruce Dixon again talked about it all the time. We need to build infrastructure, dues-paying infrastructures, all sorts of different infrastructures to getting money independently with no strings attached from things like foundations.
And I just wanted to add, there was a time when you had to pay to get information. You had to pay for a newspaper, subscribe to a magazine. The internet gives us a lot of information for free. But let's not forget, we had to pay for stuff. So support blackagendareport.com the next time you log on, and others. And UNAC raises money. So all of us, if there's a site or an individual you like in particular, support them with your money. And as the questioner pointed out, any amount is helpful. Yes, Judy, you were going to add
I was just
something?
going to add that it's not only our labor. Everything costs money now. I mean, I started out with a little free website somewhere, and then the combination of events, and so now I rent a suite of space to put my websites on the internet, and then I needed to pay for security, and you need to have some of the better tools just cost money. It's not a lot of money, but it adds up if you got 5 websites or whatever. And I had my websites taken down at one point, so security is really a big stress point for me because it's very disturbing to have everything destroyed all at once. So another thing you have to realize with anybody who's out there is that it's costing some amount of money for the infrastructure, for their presence out there, unless all they're doing is tweeting or sending out a lot of emails. So that's another point. Encryption is just more than we need to talk about, probably, because it bars you from connections, is what it does, because not everything passes seamlessly from encrypted to not. So it's not ideal in some circumstances.
Thank you. So.
Have there been any successful fights against the censorship? I mean, to going to court.
Wait, that's okay. And then somebody else chose to
Phil
ask a
had his
question.
hand up again too.
Joe?
Phil.
Oh, yes, I know. Okay, so let's talk about the nonprofit industrial complex and the dangers of that. Comments?
I'll start. I am a social worker by day job, and so social work is just mired in the nonprofit industrial complex as well. It's so parasitic in a lot of ways because conditions for workers, conditions for poor people have deteriorated so much for oppressed people. So nonprofits become very attractive in developing careers that are supposedly social justice oriented, and what ends up happening is that the careerist mentality that's built into these nonprofits, which in many ways are more or less democratic than standard corporations even, really wreaks havoc on consciousness, and we often find ourselves in nasty conversations. The way that people are trained in nonprofits generally, whether you're doing social work or activism, and this may not be 100% for all of them, but as a structure, we do see a lot of just nasty ways of relating to each other, very divisive ways of connecting with our peers and comrades in this struggle. I mean, I'm sure we've all been in conversations about certain issues that people who are part of this, especially in the leadership of these structures, they just don't want to have. And so they have very sophisticated and very toxic ways of just shutting you down. And I think we have to be very vigilant in having public discussions about this, because these are hard questions. They're not necessarily new, but how intense the nonprofit industrial complex is now embedded in so much, given how private and corporatized and privatized life has become here in the United States. It's a very large issue that affects, I think, every aspect of the way that imperialism works now.
The not-for-profits are a huge problem in the anti-war movement, which I know more about than the at-home part of things in terms of how it's technically worked out. But if you look at, like, Syria, you have Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and Doctors Without Borders, and not to mention some new places like Avaz, which is just a construct just to promote the lies, as far as I can tell. But the ones that have reputations going back years are now all on the wrong side. And if you look, you find that they have people in their corporate structure who are straight out of the State Department. And I know people, this is a dilemma actually, because I know people who will, like, quote Amnesty International if for some reason they happen to agree with them. But then you don't really in a good position when you want to go against them and say that they're corrupted and co-opted. So I try to stay away and not use them whether or not at a particular moment they agree with me. But I know an awful lot of people who turn around and use them when they happen to agree, which I think is counterproductive.
Exactly.
And we need to take a different perspective on who our experts are. And we need to promote a new group of experts that into the trust of the people, rather than going back to these places that truly are corrupt.
Exactly. I wanted to, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, the organization. I mentioned Alicia Garza in the previous panel, and she is an operative for the Democratic Party. And that was one of the problems with Black Lives Matter. That's why you don't hear about it anymore. Those of us, such as that Black Agenda Report, we had our eye on them. They were trying to co-opt everyone into the Democratic Party, and we spoke up about that, but they have all now become operatives. She gets huge amount of money from all the foundations, and actually that's a good indicator. If somebody's getting $500 million from the Ford Foundation, they're not for the people. It's rather clear. So I was going to take one more question. Phil? A long comment?
Both feeds with all kinds of social media, the day may come when we have to go back to econ paper. Copy of the paper finds domestic and international struggle.
Okay, I second that. I can vouch for the Virginia Defender. By the way, if you have not already, please stop by. We have people at tables. They have other great newspapers, books, etc. And yes, I think that is true. I think we have to go backwards in order to go forward. We act as though we can't communicate with people without Facebook, and you can communicate with people without Facebook, and you had better learn how. That will be the last word for our workshop. Thank you all so much. Thank you for staying and for your great comments and questions. Thank you.
So people are coming down from the other workshops, so you have the chance of getting first online.